I didn't think a glass of cranberry juice could change my life. I especially didn't think it would happen in my mother-in-law's kitchen, under warm yellow lights, while my 6-year-old twins were laughing in the next room and my husband was still scraping dessert off his plate. But that was the night everything cracked. 7 years of marriage, 11 years with the same man, countless family dinners, where I swallowed discomfort like it was part of the menu. I told myself to be patient, to be understanding, to be the reasonable wife. And then his ex cornered me by the sink and told me I was nothing more than a placeholder. She said my husband only married me because I got pregnant. She said he still loved her. She said one day he'd wake up and realize I was a mistake. I didn't scream. I didn't slap her. I didn't call my husband into the room. I turned around, lifted my wine glass, and emptied it over her head. 30 seconds later, she was screaming. 5 minutes later, the entire family was in the kitchen, and by the end of the night, I was the problem. That's when I realized something far more terrifying than an inappropriate ex. My mother-in-law was smiling. She always smiled when the other woman touched my husband. She always smiled when I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. She always smiled while pretending we were one big, happy Greek family. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that this wasn't just disrespect. It was strategy. Behind my back, the woman who called me sweetie had been plotting with my husband's ex for years, texting her, encouraging her, telling her where to sit, telling her how to make me uncomfortable, telling her over and over that I didn't belong. I was 32 years old. I had 2 sons. I was 8 weeks pregnant with a baby no one knew about yet. And the family I thought I married into had already decided I was temporary. That night wasn't about spilled juice. It was the moment I stopped pretending this was fixable and started seeing the truth I'd been trained to ignore. If you met me on a random Tuesday, hair tied up, grocery list in my phone, one kid clinging to my leg, you would never guess my marriage was a battlefield with no yelling. That's the thing about my life with Edward. From the outside, it looks steady, clean, even enviable. Edward is 34, quiet in a way that feels safe when you first fall in love with it. The kind of man who doesn't chase attention, who shows up, who packs lunches when you're too tired, who reads bedtime stories in different voices until the twins collapse into giggles. We met 11 years ago at a friend's get-together, one of those crowded apartments where everyone pretends they're not sweating. He stood by the balcony door holding a plastic cup, listening more than talking. When I said something sarcastic about how people act like adulthood is a costume, he laughed like he'd been waiting all night to laugh for real. He asked for my number at the end of the night. No cheesy line, just, "I want to keep talking to you." And we did. Dating Edward felt like stepping into calm water after years of noise. He didn't play games. He didn't flirt with strangers to prove anything. He remembered little details, how I hated cilantro, how I always read the last page of a book first. When he said he loved me, it didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like a door locking behind me in a good way. But there was always one complication that arrived with him like a shadow. His family. Edward comes from a big Greek family, the kind that treats food like love and love like something you prove by showing up. His mother, Vivian, hosts these massive dinners almost every month. She invites aunts, uncles, cousins, friends of the family, and people I swear she met once at a bakery and decided were now relatives. His father, George, is the opposite, quiet, calm. When George speaks, it isn't loud, but the room shifts toward him like gravity. I learned quickly that Vivian runs the household with energy and opinions, and George keeps the peace by choosing his words like they cost money. When Edward first brought me home, Vivian didn't openly insult me. That would have been too direct. She just didn't look at me for long. She greeted Edward like he'd returned from war. She asked him questions about his job, his appetite, his stress, his sleep, like I wasn't sitting right there holding a plate. When I answered something, she'd nod politely and turn back to him as if my voice was a commercial break. And I told myself it was cultural, it was protective, it was just how she is. Then there was Kylie. Kylie was Edward's ex from college. They dated on and off for 3 years before he met me. But Kylie didn't vanish into the past the way exes are supposed to. She stayed, because she was family. Vivian adored her. Kylie's mother and Vivian were close. Kylie had known Edward since they were younger. Kylie knew the cousins, the recipes, the inside jokes. She walked into those dinners like she belonged there in a way I still had to earn. When Edward and I got engaged, Vivian made little comments about how young we were, about how marriage is serious, about how some people don't understand commitment until it's too late. When we planned the wedding, she criticized everything. We weren't rich. We paid for most of it ourselves. I don't have a supportive family. My relationship with my mother is complicated and distant, and I barely know my father. So when Vivian hinted that a bride's family usually contributes, it landed like a slap wrapped in a smile. Edward would squeeze my hand under the table like that was supposed to fix it. And then, 2 years into our marriage, I got pregnant with twins. That's when Vivian's face changed. Overnight, I became Sweetie, Honey. She offered to babysit. She taught me Edward's favorite Greek dishes. She kissed me on both cheeks one time, and it felt like approval stamped onto my skin. I was exhausted, pregnant with 2 babies, no mother to call, no older woman to tell me what was normal. Vivian's help felt like a gift I didn't deserve. And for a while, I let myself believe we had bonded. But here's what I understand now, with painful clarity. Vivian didn't soften because she loved me. She softened because I gave her grandchildren. And Kylie? Kylie didn't touch my husband because she forgot he was married. She touched him because she wanted me to remember. By the time I admitted something was wrong, it had already been happening for years. The problem wasn't one dramatic moment. It was 1,000 small ones, quiet enough to explain away, frequent enough to rot something vital inside me. At every family gathering, Kylie found Edward. Not accidentally, not casually, intentionally. She'd place her hand on his arm while talking, her fingers lingering just a second too long. She'd lean close to whisper something in his ear, her lips nearly brushing his cheek, laughing afterward like they shared a secret. She'd reach across him to grab food from his plate instead of using her own, her body pressed into his side as if the chair beside him were hers by default. And Vivian would watch, smiling. I'd feel my shoulders tighten, my jaw lock. That slow burn start behind my eyes, the one that comes when you don't want to make a scene, but your body knows you're being disrespected. The first time I brought it up to Edward, I tried to sound calm. I don't love how Kylie touches you, I said one night after a dinner. It makes me uncomfortable. He sighed, tired in that familiar way. She's just friendly. She's always been like that. The second time I was more specific. She leans on you. She whispers in your ear. That's not normal. She does it with everyone, he said. You're reading too much into it. By the 5th time, I was angry. By the 10th, I was exhausted. By the 20th, I was starting to doubt myself. Edward's line never changed. Kylie hadn't crossed a serious line. According to him, touching his arm wasn't serious. Laughing too loud wasn't serious. Sitting too close wasn't serious. And every time I pushed, he reminded me that Kylie was a family friend, that his mother invited her, that cutting her off would cause drama. I learned very quickly what mattered more than my comfort. Peace, or at least the illusion of it. George noticed things. I could tell. Once, when Kylie tried to take my seat beside Edward at the table, George looked up and said calmly, "That seat's taken." He pointed her to the far end without raising his voice. Vivian laughed it off like it was cute. "Such a silly girl," she said, smiling at Kylie. "She forgets herself." But she never corrected her. Never once. As the years passed, the atmosphere at those dinners grew heavier for me. I started choosing outfits based on invisibility, neutral colors, loose cuts, nothing that would draw attention or invite comparison. I stopped drinking wine at family events, not because I had a problem, but because I was tired of feeling emotionally exposed. That night, I poured cranberry juice into a wine glass so no one would ask questions. I didn't want attention. I wanted quiet. What I didn't realize was how much of myself I had already made small. Every time I brought this up to Edward and he brushed it off, something inside me folded inward. I started questioning my instincts, my reactions, my worth. Maybe I was jealous. Maybe I was insecure. Maybe I should just be cooler about it. That's what gaslighting looks like when it wears a reasonable face. The truth is, Kylie never hid her intentions. She laughed too hard at Edward's jokes. She talked about their college memories like they were romantic. She'd say things like, "Remember when you hated olives?" and look at me like I was the outsider to my own marriage. And Vivian? Vivian curated it. She placed Kylie next to Edward at the table. She invited her to every gathering. She treated her presence like something inevitable instead of optional. And Edward, good man, devoted father, loyal in his own way, kept choosing not to see it. Or worse, he saw it and decided it wasn't important enough to fight. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly, like cold. And by the time we arrived at that dinner, the one where Kylie followed me into the kitchen, I was already standing on emotional ice so thin it was only a matter of time before it cracked. That night should have been easy. Vivian and George had taken the twins for 2 nights the weekend before, something they'd been asking for ever since we moved an hour away. When I called to thank Vivian and suggested we bring the boys over for dinner the following weekend, she sounded thrilled. She said she'd make it a proper family gathering, everyone invited. I agreed without hesitation. I actually like most of Edward's extended family. His cousins are funny. His aunts always bring incredible desserts. There's noise and warmth and chaos in a way that feels alive. For the first 30 minutes, everything felt normal. Then the front door opened. Kylie walked in like she'd been summoned. She wore a dress that barely pretended to be appropriate. Tight, low, calculated. Her hair was styled like she expected attention. She kissed Vivian on both cheeks, handed her a bottle of wine, and then her eyes landed on Edward. They lit up. Edward stiffened beside me. I noticed. I always notice. Dinner unfolded like a slow test of my patience. Kylie laughed too loudly, touched Edward's arm, leaned across him for food. George intervened once, quietly redirecting her seat, but Vivian just smiled, as if the entire dynamic were charming. By the time plates were cleared, my head was pounding. I went into the kitchen to help clean up, not because I had to, but because I needed space. The air felt different in there, quieter, sharper. That's when Kylie followed me. She stood in the doorway, blocking it casually, like she hadn't planned it but absolutely had. Her voice was low, almost conversational. "You know," she said, "Edward never would have married you if you hadn't gotten pregnant." My hands froze around the glass I was holding. She kept going. "He still has feelings for me. He always has. You were just convenient." She smiled, soft and cruel. A placeholder. The word landed in my chest like something breaking. She told me I was there to give him children. That eventually he'd realize he'd made a mistake, that marriages like ours didn't last. I didn't respond right away. My body went cold. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I thought about my sons in the next room, about the baby I was carrying that no one knew about yet. I turned around. The cranberry juice was still cold in the wine glass. The glass felt heavy in my hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't hesitate. I dumped the entire glass over her head. Juice soaked her hair, her makeup, her dress. For one stunned second, she just stood there blinking. Then she screamed. She ran out of the kitchen, wailing, dripping red down the hallway like I'd wounded her. I walked back into the dining room, my hands shaking, but my spine straight. People rushed toward the kitchen. Questions flew. Someone asked if I'd spilled something by accident. "Yes," I said calmly, and most of them believed me. Edward pulled me into the hallway, his face tight with anger. He hates scenes, hates tension in front of his parents. "What happened?" he whispered sharply. I told him. Every word Kylie said, every accusation, every insult. His face changed. The anger drained out of him like someone pulled a plug. "She said that?" he asked quietly. "Those exact words?" "Yes." He went silent, then he said, "We're leaving." We gathered the twins and walked out without proper goodbyes. In the car, Edward apologized for not realizing Kylie would say something that cruel. Then he told me I still shouldn't have caused a scene. He said his family would be confused, that his mother would be upset Kylie left like that. That's when something inside me snapped, not loudly but completely. "The scene isn't the problem," I said. "The problem is you never set boundaries. The problem is I've been telling you for years that her behavior isn't okay." He disagreed. He said touching his arm wasn't the same as calling me a placeholder. He said I was overreacting about the small stuff. He said Kylie was part of his family's social circle and he couldn't just cut her out. I asked him why he trusted her more than me. He said I was twisting his words. The twins started fussing in the back seat. We dropped the conversation like a live wire. But the damage was already done. Because that night didn't just expose Kylie. It exposed the fault line in my marriage. The silence that followed that night was worse than any argument we'd ever had. Edward and I didn't fight. We didn't yell. We didn't even rehash the conversation right away. We just drifted into separate corners of the house, like people carefully avoiding broken glass on the floor. I slept in the guest room, not because he asked me to, not because we agreed to it. I just couldn't bring myself to crawl into bed next to a man who had watched me be disrespected for years and only reacted when the cruelty finally sounded loud enough to offend him. Every night, I lay there replaying the scene in my head. Kylie's smile, her voice, the way she said placeholder like she'd rehearsed it, and then Edward's words in the car, "You still shouldn't have caused a scene," looping like a bruise you keep pressing to see if it still hurts. It did. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Why did it only matter now? Why was this the line when I'd been bleeding quietly for years? Why did I have to be humiliated so blatantly before he believed me? I didn't cry much. That surprised me. Instead, I felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and replaced with static. 2 days later, I did something I never thought I'd do. I wrote about it online. Not with names, not with drama. Just the facts as honestly as I could tell them. I wanted to know if I was losing my grip on reality the way Edward implied. If maybe I really was overreacting. The responses came fast, and they were almost all on my side. Strangers said my husband was allowing another woman to disrespect our marriage. They said my mother-in-law was enabling it by inviting Kylie constantly. They said I should have dumped the drink on Edward instead. I didn't agree with all of it, but the overwhelming message was clear. I wasn't crazy. I showed Edward the post a few days later, hoping, naively, that seeing other perspectives would help him understand. It backfired. He got defensive immediately. "You made me look bad," he said. "You exaggerated." I told him I'd actually downplayed it. Then, without planning to, I asked the question that had been sitting heavy in my chest for years. "Does your mother even like me?" Edward stared at me. Not for a second, not for a beat. For a full, silent minute. He didn't answer. And somehow that silence was louder than anything he could have said. I went back to the bedroom and closed the door. I stayed there the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, realizing something with a clarity that made my stomach twist. Vivian didn't tolerate Kylie because she was harmless. She tolerated me because I was useful. The next few days were brutal in their own quiet way. I stopped initiating conversations. I didn't laugh at his jokes. I didn't soften my voice. I moved through the house like someone conserving energy. Edward noticed. He didn't bring it up until one night after the twins were asleep. He said he'd try to be more firm with Kylie going forward. I told him that wasn't enough. I said I wouldn't be going to Vivian's house anymore. And that meant the twins wouldn't either, because they were too young to go without me. And Edward's work hours made it unrealistic for him to manage visits alone. That finally got his attention. He asked if I was seriously going to keep his mother from her grandchildren. I told him I was seriously going to keep myself from his mother, and the rest followed logically. He didn't have a response. Things improved slightly after that, but not because the issue was resolved. I had complications with the pregnancy. I ended up in the hospital for monitoring. The baby was fine. I was fine. But fear has a way of pressing pause on arguments without fixing them. Edward became attentive, softer. We slept in the same bed again. We talked more, laughed a little. But the real problem just sat there, untouched. And I knew, deep down, that the next time Vivian planned a family gathering, everything we were avoiding would come rushing back. Because this wasn't about Kylie anymore. It was about whether I mattered enough to be protected before the damage was undeniable. 2 weeks later, Vivian stopped texting me. She called Edward instead. I knew something was wrong the moment he said her name out loud. His shoulders tightened. His tone shifted into that careful neutrality he used when he didn't want to upset anyone, except usually me. "She's planning a big Sunday lunch for Dad's birthday," he said. "She wants everyone there, including the twins." I didn't hesitate. "No?" Edward blinked, like he hadn't expected the word to come so cleanly. "It's my father's birthday," he said gently. "George has always been good to you." That part was true. George had never made me feel small. He noticed things. He intervened quietly. He treated me like a person, not an accessory. But I also knew this wasn't really about George. "Kylie will be there," I said. Edward shook his head. "I told her not to invite Kylie." I didn't believe him. He must have seen it on my face because he pulled out his phone and showed me the message. He'd asked Vivian to keep it small, family only. She'd responded with a thumbs-up emoji. I agreed to go, for George. The morning of the lunch, I had a bad feeling, the kind that settles in your chest before your mind catches up. I told myself I was being paranoid. I dressed the twins, packed snacks, smiled in the mirror until it looked convincing. When we arrived, everything seemed fine. Smaller group, quieter, no Kylie. For 20 minutes, I let myself breathe. Then the doorbell rang. Vivian jumped up, already smiling. She opened the door, and Kylie walked in holding a wrapped gift and a bottle of wine. She kissed Vivian on both cheeks and handed her the bottle like it was part of a ritual. Then she saw me. Her face lit up. Edward went red. Not angry red, embarrassed red. He immediately pulled his mother aside. I watched them talking in the corner, Vivian shrugging, shaking her head, waving a hand like Edward was being dramatic. Edward came back and said, "We're leaving." No discussion, no hesitation. He was already getting the twins' jackets. Vivian followed us to the door, hissing that we were being rude, that we were ruining George's birthday, that we were making a scene. George stepped in. "Let them go," he said calmly. "We'll talk later." We left. In the car, Edward apologized over and over. He said he'd specifically told his mother not to invite Kylie. He said he didn't know she'd ignore him. I asked him if she'd ever listened to him about Kylie. He didn't answer. When we got home, Edward called his mother. I could hear her through the phone, even without speaker. She was yelling. She said he embarrassed her. She said I had turned him against his family. She said I was controlling and manipulative. Then Edward said something I'd been waiting years to hear. "She disrespected my wife," he said. "She disrespected my marriage." Vivian laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly. She laughed. She told him he'd made a mistake marrying me. She said he should have stayed with Kylie. She said Kylie understood the family better, fit in better. She said I trapped him with a pregnancy. Edward hung up. We sat on the couch in silence, the twins watching cartoons in the other room. Finally, Edward spoke. "I didn't realize it was this bad," he said. I reminded him that I'd asked weeks ago if his mother even liked me, and he couldn't answer. He admitted he'd always known she preferred Kylie, that when he first brought me home, Vivian commented on how different I was, less suitable, less polished. He thought she'd get over it. George called the next day. He talked to Edward for over an hour. I only heard one side, but when Edward hung up, his face was different, older somehow. George knew. He'd always known Vivian never accepted me. He just didn't realize how actively she'd been working against our marriage. Then came the explanation that made everything click. Vivian and Kylie's mother had been close friends. When Edward and Kylie dated in college, Vivian started planning their future together. When Edward broke up with Kylie, Vivian was devastated. When Edward chose me, she blamed me. That's why the coldness, the criticism, the constant invitations where Kylie just happened to be there. It was never about me being inadequate. It was about me not being Kylie. Edward stopped responding to his mother's messages. She showed up at our house 3 days later. Edward blocked the doorway when she tried to push past him. She demanded to see her grandchildren. He said no. She cried on our doorstep, said she was sorry, said she wanted her family back. Edward told her she could have a relationship with him and the twins, but not if Kylie was involved, and she needed to apologize to me. Vivian looked past him, looked straight at me. She didn't apologize. She turned around and left. That was when George started calling more often. He wanted to see the twins. I had no issue with that. We arranged visits without Vivian. Edward explained everything to his cousin Andreas, who admitted he'd always thought Kylie was too comfortable, but assumed it wasn't his place to say anything. And then, the truth came crashing down. George showed up at our house one afternoon, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He sat at our kitchen table and put his head in his hands. He'd gone through Vivian's phone. Messages, years of them. Texts between Vivian and Kylie, encouraging her not to give up on Edward, complaining about me, planning how to make me uncomfortable at family events. Messages from George's birthday, Vivian telling Kylie to come no matter what Edward said, Kylie replying that she hoped seeing her would remind Edward of what he'd given up. There was one message that gutted me. The grandchildren deserve a better mother. I read the screenshots twice. My hands were shaking. This wasn't insecurity. This was a campaign. Edward went silent. When he finally spoke, he asked his father why he was showing us this now. George said because he was ashamed. He said he was considering separating from Vivian. That night, Edward and I sat in the living room alone. I asked him if this changed anything. He said he'd prioritize keeping peace with his mother over protecting his wife. And I realized something terrifying. Vindication doesn't heal what neglect destroys. I thought seeing the messages would make me feel relieved. I thought proof would give me peace. Instead, it hollowed me out. After George left that day, Edward and I sat in the living room without turning on a single light. The house felt too quiet, like even the walls were listening. The twins were at a play date. For once, there were no small voices to distract me from my thoughts. I stared at the floor and realized something I wasn't ready to admit. I had been right for years, and that somehow hurt more than being wrong. Edward kept apologizing, not defensively this time, not carefully. He sounded broken in a way I'd never heard before. He said he didn't know his mother was capable of something so calculated, that he thought she was just overbearing, traditional, stubborn. I listened, nodding, saying very little, because the truth was darker than anything he was saying out loud. It didn't matter why Vivian did it anymore. What mattered was that for 7 years, I had been asking my husband to protect me, and he hadn't. Not because he didn't love me, but because loving me wasn't inconvenient enough until it exploded. That night, after Edward fell asleep, I lay awake and replayed our entire marriage like a film I suddenly understood in a different language. Every time I felt uncomfortable at a family dinner, every time I was told to let it go, every time my instincts were gently dismissed as overthinking, I thought about how many times I had swallowed my feelings to keep the peace. How many times I had smiled while another woman touched my husband. How many times I told myself that being easygoing was the same thing as being strong. And then I thought about my children, about the example I was setting, about what it teaches a daughter to watch her mother tolerate disrespect so other people don't feel uncomfortable, about what it teaches sons to see their mother minimized and learn that love means silence. I didn't cry loudly. I cried the way you do when you're trying not to wake anyone. Tears soaked into the pillow, heavy and slow. Edward asked me the next morning if I was okay. I told him I didn't know. That was the most honest answer I'd given in weeks. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. We functioned. We made meals. We talked logistics. We co-parented well. From the outside, we probably looked fine. Inside, something had fractured beyond repair. I kept thinking about the moment weeks earlier when I'd asked Edward if his mother even liked me, and he couldn't answer. He'd known. On some level, he'd always known. And still, he'd asked me to keep trying, to keep showing up, to keep hoping. That realization settled in my chest like a weight. Edward started doing everything right, too late. He blocked Kylie. When she showed up at his office, he had security escort her out. When she emailed him, he deleted the messages without reading them. He stopped responding to Vivian entirely. But boundaries set after damage aren't the same as boundaries that prevent it. One night, I asked Edward something quietly, without accusation. If this had never blown up, how long would you have let it go on? He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Too long." That was when I knew. There are moments in a marriage where nothing dramatic happens, but something ends anyway. It wasn't anger that killed it. It was exhaustion. I was 5 months pregnant when we found out we were having a girl. George cried when we told him. He asked if he could buy the crib. Vivian didn't know. I watched Edward hold the ultrasound picture and smile, and part of me broke in a way I didn't have words for. Because I still loved him. And love isn't always enough. By the time I realized I couldn't look at Edward without remembering every time he chose comfort over courage, it was already too late to undo it. The darkest moment wasn't a fight. It was clarity. The understanding that even if Edward chose me now, fully, fiercely, it didn't erase the years I spent standing alone while he asked me to be patient. And patience, once it runs out, doesn't refill. The turning point didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly on a Tuesday afternoon when George called and asked if he could come over. His voice sounded wrong, thin, older than it should have. When he arrived, he didn't take his coat off. He didn't sit right away. He stood in the kitchen like a man who didn't know where to put the weight of what he was carrying. Then he told us the truth had gotten worse. Vivian hadn't just been manipulating Kylie. She had been lying to everyone. George explained that one of Edward's cousins, Alani, had called him confused and upset. Vivian had been telling people that I physically attacked Kylie at the dinner, that I'd been aggressive, unstable, that the family was afraid of me. George said he confronted her immediately. At first, she doubled down, said it was true. George told her he was there that night, that he watched it happen, that it looked accidental. Vivian changed her story. She admitted I dumped the drink on purpose, but claimed I'd been verbally abusing Kylie all evening. George said that was impossible. He hadn't left the table. That's when Vivian finally admitted what Kylie had told her. Kylie claimed she confronted me about flirting with other men at family gatherings. George went quiet when he told us this. His eyes were wet, not with tears, but with disbelief. "She lied," he said, "and your mother believed her." Then he pulled out his phone. Screenshots. Messages between Vivian and Kylie, going back years. Not just complaints. Plans. Instructions. Encouragement. Vivian telling Kylie where to sit at dinners. Vivian complaining that George liked me too much and was ruining everything. Vivian telling Kylie not to give up on Edward. Kylie asking if Edward would leave me eventually. Vivian responding that she hoped so. There was a message from 3 years ago that made my stomach turn. The grandchildren deserve a better mother. I felt my body go cold. Edward didn't speak while reading. When he finished, he handed the phone back to his father and asked one question. "Why are you showing us this now?" George swallowed. "Because I'm ashamed." He said he'd ignored signs for years, that he knew Vivian didn't like me, but he never imagined she was actively trying to destroy our marriage. He said he confronted her with the messages. She didn't apologize. She said she was protecting her son from a bad marriage. George told us he had contacted a lawyer, not to file immediately, but to understand his options. "I can't stay married to someone who would do this," he said quietly. After he left, Edward and I sat in the living room again. The twins were at school. The house was too still. Edward said he didn't recognize his mother anymore, that he always thought her behavior came from fear or tradition, but this showed intention. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I asked Edward if this changed anything for him. He asked what I meant. I told him the truth. "This explains everything," I said, "but it doesn't undo anything." I told him I spent years doubting myself because he kept telling me I was imagining things, that he asked me to keep trying with a woman who never wanted me in the family. He didn't argue. He said I was right. And in that moment, something shifted, not toward healing, but toward honesty. We stopped pretending this was just about his mother. It was about trust, about believing your partner before the damage becomes undeniable. Edward said he was choosing me now. I believed him, but belief didn't erase the past. It just clarified the future. Because sometimes the turning point isn't choosing to stay. It's realizing that leaving doesn't mean you didn't love enough. It means you finally loved yourself enough to stop disappearing. The fallout didn't explode. It collapsed, quietly, inevitably, like a structure that had been hollowed out for years, finally giving in to gravity. Edward didn't speak to his mother after that. Not because I asked him to, not because we made a rule. He just stopped. Vivian texted, called, left voicemails that swung wildly between rage and remorse. One minute she was accusing me of tearing the family apart. The next she was crying, saying she didn't mean it, saying she just wanted her grandchildren back. Edward didn't respond. George started coming over once a week. He brought groceries, played with the twins, held my belly and talked to the baby in Greek, his voice soft and reverent. He never defended Vivian, never asked me to reconsider. He just showed up. That told me everything I needed to know. Word spread through the family, slowly at first, then all at once. Vivian told her version. Edward told the truth. Some people chose comfort over clarity. They said family should forgive no matter what, that Vivian was old-fashioned, that she didn't mean harm. Others went quiet when Edward showed them screenshots. And some, more than I expected, apologized. His cousin Andreas called first. He said he'd always thought Kylie was too comfortable around Edward, but didn't want to interfere. He told Edward he believed us, that he'd talk to the others. Kylie tried once more. She showed up at Edward's office 2 weeks later, unannounced. Security escorted her out. Edward blocked her number, deleted her emails without reading them. According to Andreas, Kylie started telling people that Edward was in a controlling marriage, that I'd brainwashed him. 3 months later, she moved to another city. She got engaged. Vivian was devastated. George told us she genuinely believed Edward and Kylie would find their way back to each other eventually. That illusion died hard. As for Vivian, she refused to apologize. She sent flowers to the hospital when I gave birth later that year. I had the nurse throw them away. She sent a card I never opened. She showed up at the house once. I didn't answer the door. Edward told her that if she wanted a relationship with the children, it required accountability. She chose denial instead. That choice cost her everything. George separated from her officially. He said the messages weren't the only issue, just the one he couldn't ignore anymore. He filed for divorce quietly. Half the family stopped talking to Vivian. The other half thought we were dramatic. I stopped caring. By the time our daughter was born, 6 weeks earlier than planned, pink and furious and perfect, Edward and I were already living in a different reality. We were functioning, but we weren't healing. We tried. We went on dates, talked late into the night, made plans for after the baby. Edward did everything right, now. But every time I looked at him, I remembered all the times he didn't. Not cruelly, not maliciously. Just abstinent. About a month before my due date, I told him I wanted a separation. He cried. I didn't. He asked if there was anything he could do to change my mind. I said no. He moved into an apartment 15 minutes away. He came every day to see the kids, took the twins twice a week overnight, held our daughter like she was made of glass. He was, and still is, a good father. That was never the question. Vivian tried again after the birth. Edward told her to apologize to me directly. She hasn't. George was at the hospital. He cried when he held his granddaughter. He asked if he could buy the crib. We said yes. Edward asked me once, quietly, if I thought we made a mistake getting married. I told him the truth. No, I said. The mistake wasn't marrying you. The mistake was how we handled your mother. He agreed. The fallout didn't ruin Edward's life. It clarified it. It stripped away the illusion that avoiding conflict preserves love. And it left me standing in something unfamiliar but solid. Peace. Not because I won, but because I finally stopped accepting less than I deserved. 6 weeks after my daughter was born, I sat alone in the nursery at 3 in the morning, rocking her while the house slept. Her name is Penelope. She has my eyes, Edward's nose, and a cry that sounds like she's already angry at the world for underestimating her. In that quiet, milk-scented darkness, something inside me finally settled. Not healed, not erased, but settled. Edward and I are separated now. Not bitterly, not dramatically, just honestly. He comes every day. He shows up for the kids. He holds Penelope and sings to her softly, like he's afraid to miss a single moment. We are good parents. We are no longer good partners. And that truth took me a long time to accept without guilt. Because love doesn't disappear just because trust erodes. It fades differently. It becomes something you respect instead of something you live inside. George still comes over once a week. He brings groceries. He plays with the twins. He speaks Greek to Penelope and tells her stories about her father as a boy. He never asks me to forgive Vivian. He never defends her. He carries his own grief quietly. Vivian still hasn't apologized. At this point, I don't expect her to. Some people would rather lose everything than admit they were wrong. Kylie is gone. The family drama has quieted. The dust has settled where it needed to. And me? I'm tired, but I'm free. Here's what I learned. What I wish someone had told me years ago, before I learned it the hard way. Being patient is not the same as being respected. Keeping the peace is not the same as being loved. And silence does not make you strong, it makes you disappear. If your partner only defends you when the damage is undeniable, ask yourself how much pain you had to absorb before you were worth protecting. If a family tolerates you but never accepts you, believe what their actions are telling you, not the crumbs of kindness they offer when it benefits them. And most importantly, your children do not need you to stay in a situation that slowly erases you just so things look intact from the outside. They need to see what self-respect looks like. Penelope will grow up knowing her father loves her. The twins will grow up knowing their mother chose herself. And I will grow older knowing I stopped asking people to treat me with dignity and started requiring it. Some endings aren't loud. They're just honest. And sometimes that's the bravest kind.